So we're going to go back now and just work with that first layer, and I'm going to show you what we can do to modify specific plants to react a little more realistically to the light. Actually, I'll go ahead and keep both these layers for the moment, and we can just kind of do it the same way for both layers. I am going to remove the winter tree from the plum layer. Go ahead and clear that out. Go back to the first layer, remove the large dead tree. And going back to the plum layer, actually I will go ahead. So what I want to do is modify one of the larger trees to have the leaves droop down, more of one of those edge type ecosystems. So go ahead and remove that for now. The plum tree itself doesn't have a lot of detail, so it really wouldn't work well for these larger trees that I'm going to be creating. So we're going to start with that first layer, populate, and instead of using the offset function, which you could leave enabled to add even more variation to the scene. Actually, we'll just go ahead and leave that for now. If it's causing issues, I can remove it. So these are going to be the inside trees. So we need to modify it to react to the light, more like a forest tree, which is going to be growing upwards more instead of off to the sides. And we're going to go ahead and edit that. So we can go to the Library tab, which is going to give us a list of ecosystem objects in the scene. And what we can do is select the rural maple tree, go down to the bottom, and edit selected master object. Technically, this is not a master object. A master object is a cloned or a copied object, so using copy-paste and having no modification. That way a master object allows you to, let's say if we copied a terrain, pasted it, a master object would be another object we could size to scale both terrains. It doesn't work the same way, where Eon does not consider the ecosystem population to be a master object, even though you have to select Edit Master Object in order to edit it. So now we have the plant editor open for this instance, and what we can do is edit the object without having to change any of the population objects or the veg file and save out a new species. We can just edit it directly through here. So we want to start by getting it to grow upward more. What we can do is reduce the fall-off amount. And the fall-off adjusts the scaling, in this case, lengthening the trunk, reducing the distance, or increasing the distance between the trunks and branches, really depending on which direction they go. So if we increase the fall-off, we have branches coming directly from the base. Say -100, we have a much larger trunk. So now what we can do, since there's only one subset with the maple tree, like I said, it's one of the older ones, so there's not a lot of editing, but what we can do is take the angle and just kind of bring that in a little more to make more of a forest type tree, where it's going to focus most of its energy on keeping the branches that are up higher and grow in the direction of the light. So we're not going to worry about the angle. And if we grow a couple of new ones, we can take a look at the variation. We might want to reduce the fall-off a little, because with the maple tree, when the angle is set so low, what can happen is it's really going to take a very large cluster of leaves on top and put them together a little too densely. So we might need to make some modifications that way. We could also reduce the drooping amount, bring that down a little lower. If we reduce the droop all the way, it's really going to bring those branches together very tightly. So we won't make that large of a modification of the droop. It's -30, -80 for the angle. Fall off we'll set to -65. And then if you want, you can also increase the length of the branches. Let's go ahead and do 5. Not a whole lot. Not going to make any huge changes. Randomness of the leaves affecting the one subset. Depending on the type of tree you're editing, this may work an upward function where the lower leaves are going to be smaller than the upper leaves. But with this tree, randomness is just kind of an overall variance. So we'll just set that to 0. We can modify the flexibility. Make it look a little more realistic. Trying to get rid of some of those flatter polygons around the edges. Really kind of modifying the way the light hits it. I want to get something that's going to work and look a little more realistic. So we've got 100 for flexibility, -51 for the curl. So go ahead and click OK, and it's going to update the ecosystem object and repopulate. Really doesn't matter if you have a dynamic pop on or not. It should update it. If not, what we can do is go back and repopulate it. It looks like maybe the preview hasn't been adjusted. So the OpenGL, in this case, does look like it's exactly the same as it was before. We'll just go ahead and do a quick render to make sure that that change was set. Because the trees are going below the terrain, it's a little difficult to tell whether or not it applied that. So what I want to do is go into that function for the offset, and I don't want to remove it completely because I might want to come back to it. So what I want to use is the constant number, set it to -1. As of version 8, Vue does tend to delete some of the unconnected nodes. In this case, that -3 is even still in there. So that might only apply to graphs. But instead, I really just don't want these map settings to be overwritten. So what I'm going to use is one of my meta nodes, on-off. So off, I'm going to connect to -1. On is connected to the map. Connect that to the on-off button and turn it off. So off is going to be that -1, so it should be no offset. This is a really simple node. What it does is has 2 double inputs, on and off, connects to a blender, and the blender ratio is controlled by a Boolean number, which is that on-off switch. When it's on, it returns a value of 1. When it's off, it returns a value of -1. Since a blender only operates between 0 and 1, you set it to clip the ratio at 0 to 1, and that way you won't go beyond the output, and it works as an on-off switch. So pretty straightforward. Combiner, blender, ratio connected to a Boolean number, on and off as the double inputs or numeric inputs. All the double input is it allows you to connect outside of the node. So wherever it returns really depends on the inside of the meta node. I'll go ahead and just include this meta node so you can load it in. If you want to learn more about installing the meta nodes, being able to access them within the program, or anything else, you can consult the Snowflake manual, which is a program I developed, or a set of meta nodes for Vue. And that manual is made available on the asileFX website. It's a PDF file at the moment. It might be HTML in the future. So really, depending on when you're watching the training, it might be an HTML page where you can access that information. But there's loads of information in there about functions. So even if you don't own Snowflake, you can still learn a lot about Vue by reading some of the descriptions and some of the overall notes about the function editor and the collection. So we've got that turned off, so now that offset should not be applied. And I just want to make sure and see if we've got a lot of leaves towards the top. So we should see a lot more trunks. But it looks like it's really just not dripping down enough. That might have been just for that specific variation. So let's go back and edit. And it looks like it actually did not remember any of the settings and changes I made. So I'm just going to set those back. I think I know why it did that. But I can't be certain until I try it again. So I'm just kind of setting that back. Click OK. And it might have been the way I clicked off of the object. Reselect the terrain. And let's just repopulate. And I may have found a bug. Not uncommon, unfortunately. And it looks like those just weren't applied. To avoid this, because that is a really useful tool, I'm thinking that it may be caused by the fact that there's another layer with nothing on it. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the other ecosystem layer, clear out the population completely. And of course, with a cleared population, we can't access the object. So we'll keep the population on. Let's go ahead, and I am going to enable master object addition modes. Select the object, and it should show in the scene. So we're going to edit the object that way. It does still have the terrain selected, so we'll go back, use the other button, edit master object, and let's just see if we can get this to work, because it is really useful. So to find the process for it, it's really going to help things. Click OK, and it should disappear if we're not seeing the materials. Then we should be deselected from the object. Right now we can still see the bark, but it did, in this case, update the object. So it does look like having that clear ecosystem layer with nothing on it was causing the issue. So just make sure that if you want to use the mode, that there's no additional layers without any population on them, or that have a clear population, because it looks like at the moment that's interfering with this addition. So now we can see more of those forest-type trees. It's definitely working now. So now we need to have our original tree, which of course in this case we can't use the same maple tree. Although we might be able to use it in a different layer. Whether or not it'll interfere with the edited changes, only doing it will show. So we'll select the grass, which is the lower layer, add ecosystem, raise it up above the current ecosystem layer. I'm going to add in a plant. Let's go ahead and select that maple tree and just see whether or not it's going to be affected by modifying that proxy. And it looks like it is not, which is quite fortunate. Because that is a lot less work for us to do, to have to save out other objects. We can just create another layer, although we would not be able to use this on the same layer. So let's use the affinity with layer. Let's go ahead and bring it up to 50. Increase our density. And now what we have are the edited and the original. And we should be able to fill in around the edges with that new layer on top. And turn off the decay, increase density. Let's go ahead and bring the scale down to 0.09. And now the reason everything is scaled the way it is because I should have mentioned this earlier. Go to File, Options, and my internal unit is set to 1 meter, which originally the internal unit was 0.1 meters. So then all the trees were automatically set to 1 for their initial scale to be real world. But recently the new default is now 1 meter. So to preserve the size of natural elements at creation, which is a checkbox in the object options, under File Options, General Preferences, that will change the scale of those objects in relation to the internal unit. So if you're seeing a different scale than what I currently have, it's probably because your internal unit is set up differently. So now we have something a little more realistic. Depending on the density of those other objects and the amount of infinity, you might have to increase that a little bit more. Otherwise, we're going to have way too many trees in the wrong places. So go back, edit the material, and that's because the environment is not set the way it was before. So let's go ahead and set the environment to 0.6 for the slope range, to let's do 0.85. I'll have a little mixing. You see a slight reduction, or actually a major reduction, around these steeper slopes, and the rest of it really see the full object. So now the scaling, I also need to match up a little more, on 0.1, otherwise they're going to stretch up way too high in the z-axis, or actually all the axes. Go ahead and take a look at a render. Okay, so what I want to do is go back and use that offset function from before to control the new layer. And what I'm going to do for that is go into the first layer. Let's go ahead and rename these. Inner forest for the bottom layer, and forest edge for the top layer. And that way it would be a little bit easier to see what we're working with here. So it's not all named the same. I'm going to turn off that shrink at low densities, and anytime you're using a direct population where you're not using dynamic population and you have the affinity with layer being used, you do need to repopulate anytime there's a change made to the lower layers in order for it to work correctly, because it is relying on the population from the layer below it in order to create the distribution. So it is important that you repopulate if you're not using dynamic population. If you're using dynamic population, then you can just re-render the scene, or even just a preview to repopulate. So what we need to do is select the offset from surface. All we really need is that map filter. So what we can do is just select the map filter. You can hit Control-C to copy. Since it's already been selected, the next filter we create in the function editor will be identical. So we'll go to the top layer, offset from surface, drive with the function, connect that to the slope, select the link, and click filter. Now it looks like it did not reuse the same filter, so we can Control V to paste it in, and then we need to just connect our function. It used to remember, at least I believe it used to remember between functions. It looks like it doesn't anymore. So now we have a lower range. Let's go ahead and set to 0.7. And we can go ahead and repopulate, which should drop those down. And it did. So now we have a lot more variance with this kind of function control. And if you need to have the same layer creating this effect, or we're editing the same tree, there is a way to do it. What I'm going to do is delete that forest edge. And of course, when I go to add in a plant, select the maple tree. Because I edited it it is actually working. So we can load in the same tree. If it's unedited, probably won't be able to do that. And here we can see the error that you would normally see. So in this case, since it's unedited, we don't need to add in or edit the object. So it does actually create a temporary file for the other object if it works correctly. Looks like it is distributing them properly. So even though I don't have the distribution setting, we would need to drive the presence with the slope as we did before. But one thing I did want to show you is now if I want another unedited maple tree, add a plant. Now the yellow maple tree is still based off the original maple tree, so we can add that in and then modify the material. So what we're going to do is go over to the materials. And we're just going to collapse these panels for now. What we can do is select the maple leaf, copy, so right click, copy material, go into the yellow maple leaf, paste the material, and now the yellow maple tree is going to be just like the other maple tree. So we can also edit the ecosystem from here, or select the material. So if we repopulate, we're now going to see it may still generate the OpenGL being the yellow maple tree, but it is in fact going to render with the other material. Because whenever you modify materials within this browser, it's not necessarily going to update OpenGL plant previews, which is currently one of the bugs. Really the only way to get the OpenGL to refresh is to edit it within the plant editor, which doesn't always work. So what I want to do is we can go ahead and try that. Copy the material, go over to the proxy, yellow maple, open the object, right click, paste the material onto the maple leaf, update it, click OK, and see if it updates the OpenGL. It might not work. It does look like it did. So if you need to update the OpenGL to keep it the same, or so it looks the way it was actually going to look in the render, then you do need to use that proxy editing in the master object, or quote-unquote pseudo master object, in order to update that. Otherwise, if you want to keep them separated, that is kind of a cool way to manipulate the OpenGL without actually affecting the render. Now, this big tree you're seeing sticking out is that master object. What it's doing is creating a temporary proxy object to represent the ecosystem. You can't edit this object directly within the scene. It is really being hidden from the scene right now. Once you click out of this panel, it is going to disappear. So you can view it in the scene, manipulate it, although it won't actually probably have any sort of change to it. And then once you go over to the other tab, it's gone. It's going to disappear. So it is just kind of a temporary proxy, just to allow you to get into the plant editor. So now that we have it all on one layer, if we want to go over to the slope range, bring that back down to 0.6 as we originally had it in the first setup, we can go back, adjust the distribution, keeping in mind that the inner tree is now or the first part of the population, which is going to require the lowest number. Therefore, we need to invert the output of the map. So we can use the distribution, extracting it, connecting it to slope. And I'm just using slope. You can, of course, use anything. Also a mixin of different things, which we'll take a look at in the next sections. But for now, we'll just grab that, add in a filter, change that to the map filter. Our range, go ahead and do 0.6, lower value -1, or actually 1, because we do need to reverse it, upper value -1. And we should have our forest showing. We need to limit the range because we do have two objects on the inside, or what would be on the outside. We can either remove the other variation, or we need to adjust that range to work a little bit better with the current presence number.